America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jamie Bowers, executive producer and the Ed McMahon of the Main Street Matters podcast. I decided to make it a title here, Elaine, official.
Well, thanks for sitting in again, Jamie. I always have a good time with you. And you can subscribe to the show at SalemPodcastNetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Jamie, today we are joined by Doug Kantor. Doug is the general counsel at the National Association of Convenience Stores. Doug successfully works every aspect of public policy, the public policy process to assess his clients' needs, draft legislation, and advocate for the right outcomes. So that is definitely what we want to hear about. But before he joins us, jobs numbers, we heard them come out last week. They were certainly surprising. ADP was reporting about 87,000, and instead we saw 336,000 jobs created last month. The unemployment and labor force participation rates were pretty flat, though, didn't move at all. The biggest thing is to look at this. I know that the administration takes a victory lap every month on the jobs created, but the underlying currents beneath these numbers have a very disturbing trend, and that is that real wages continue to fall because prices are so inflated, and there just seems to be no end to how high prices are going. And what it tells us is that the Fed may have to act again in an aggressive way, which is going to be increasing interest rates, making it harder for everyday ordinary Americans, making it harder for our small businesses to get credit. And those are the things that the administration just seems to ignore.
Yeah, it's, we've talked about this before. The thing with the inflation, yes, some of the inflation numbers are coming down, but that doesn't mean that prices are coming down. It means that the rate of inflation, the rate of increases are going down. But it's still, Americans are paying $3, $4 a gallon for gas. And as you said, the interest rates have been going up a lot, in which, if you have credit card debt, if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, all of those things mean that you're paying more for the things that you have to service, any debts that you have to service, which means there's fewer dollars in your pocket, and it doesn't go as far as it used to. So, yeah, it's great that we're creating jobs, and I think that is a positive. We have to give credit for job creation, but if everyone is making less money, then I don't know how worth it is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ripple effects to talk about. The cost of energy is high, the cost of gas, which makes the cost of groceries go up. It's just a constant domino effect. But one of the other things that is happening because of the interest rates is we're seeing mortgage rates creep up to a decade's high, almost 8%. And so what's happening is people who have been in their homes and were thinking about selling, they've got these ultra low mortgage rates, 2, 3, maybe 4% tops. And so the thought of selling and going to another home, they'd have to take on an 8% mortgage interest rate. And so people are staying put. So inventories are going down. People aren't selling and people aren't buying. And that has just such a huge ripple effect as well on the price of homes and everything like that. So the ripple effects continue to happen. And while the top line numbers, I think, are misleading, is probably the right way to say it, or they don't tell the whole story. I mean, the reality is they are what they are, but they also keep getting adjusted every month retroactively downward, which doesn't get
Sure.
any of the any of the headlines at all.
Sure.
And so those real headline numbers every month are eye popping, and then the next month they get adjusted down, like, oh, we made a mistake, sorry about that.
Yeah.
But the reality is those underlying currents are very treacherous for our small business owners. And it is hurting small business owners. It is hurting everyday ordinary Americans in trying to make ends meet. And Americans are suffering. And I just think this administration just is really tone deaf in that. And they just want to keep seeing these headlines with the jobs numbers, but they're not actually looking at the real data.
Well, one thing I think is interesting is when you get this real wages going down, what the administration, maybe not the administration, but some on the left, then instead of saying, "Oh wow, we probably spent too many tax dollars uh, in the system, which is now causing the inflation," they kind of double down and then say, well, we need to raise minimum wages, we need to mandate certain benefits, things like that, because people have less money in their pocket. So they the problem that big government caused, they then look to solve with more big government. In fact, in this past weekend, Representative Barbara Lee from California suggested offhandedly in a forum, she's running for Dianne Feinstein's seat in the Senate, that the minimum wage should be $50 an hour. Well, you can say that it should be that, but the consequences from an economic standpoint are unbelievable. That translates into about $104,000 a year as a salary, and you're saying, okay, if you have a high school education and are an entry level worker at McDonald's, you should be paid over $100,000. That would be nice, but I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think that that kind of thinking. It bothers me that she is a legislator looking at policies across the board, because it says to me she has zero idea how a business works and how the economy works.
Well, or she just doesn't care, and it's just a way to promise voters, the freebies, and that in hopes of being elected. Is $50 an hour is what's being proposed by a legislator in 2023. I can remember in 2020 when during the Democratic primary, I think it was Bernie Sanders, but don't quote me on it. But one of the Democratic candidates suggested a $22 an hour minimum wage, and I thought, oh my gosh, how much higher can they go? Well, here we are in 2023.
You go for broke.
Exactly. Why not? Why not $100 an hour? I mean, why stop?
Right.
Anyway, so crazy times, crazy times. Well, now it is time for our interview with Doug Kantor, the Vice President and General Counsel of NAS. Doug, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, Doug, I know that Nacs represents thousands of small business convenience stores around the country. I know they're very concerned about credit card swipe fees. I mean, I actually hear about it from a hairdresser, believe it or not. She's an independent, just rents her chair. So I know it's a big deal. She and I talk about stuff all the time. So she shared it. So if you're a small business convenience store, I mean, what are the swipe fees, first of all? Because I think consumers, we don't think about it. We just toss our card down and, we don't think about it. But from the perspective of those small business convenience stores, tell us how that plays into things for small business owners struggling.
The fees are huge, and that's why you're hearing about it from your hairdresser. If you talk to a local restaurateur, your favorite restaurant, they'll tell you about it. Any of these small Main Street businesses feel it because on average, this is their second highest operating cost. Only labor is more than these swipe fees. It's unbelievable. It's more than rent. It's more than utilities. It's more than healthcare costs. You can go on with the costs these businesses obviously have to deal with, but this one is the second highest. In fact, in many years in the convenience store channel specifically, it was higher than the net profits that the industry made. And that's a situation where, these businesses take all the risk, right? They put their capital on the line. They invest in their buildings and sites, employees. For our folks who sell gasoline, there's a lot of environmental risk. They've got to handle that stuff right. For all that risk, for them to make less money on the other end than the credit card industry makes, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow.
That is crazy to me. Is there something unique about the convenience store industry that also is affected? Are there like per transaction fees in addition to the percentage that they have to pay that then also kind of add up?
There are, all of these fees are both a fee might be, say, 20 cents, plus the percentage might be 2-3%, something like that. But it hits everybody, and every retail channel has their own tale of woe here. Convenience stores are one of them, and sometimes they get an extra hit because you might pay once with your card when you fill up your car with gas, and then go inside and get a soft drink and something to eat, and pay again with your card, and so they get the fees twice. But think about it, movie theaters are very similar. Most people will buy their movie ticket online, pay with a card. They'll show up and then they want to go get, popcorn and a soft drink. And so the theaters are taking the hit twice as well. But for all these stores, grocery, restaurants, you name it, they all get hit very hard by these fees.
And if these fees, is there a motivation now to do something about it? Have the fees been going up, or are they been steady? I mean, clearly they're high, but what has been happening to them, especially through COVID?
The fees have been exploding. Um, Look, the fees always go up because this is a broken market that doesn't have the normal market dynamics. But just since COVID in 2020, the fees are up more than 50%. So think about that. Your second highest operating cost in just a few years goes up by more than 50%. And in a way that you can't predict or plan for, that's really tough.
What's driving it?
What's driving it is that these fees are charged by the banks that give us all our credit cards. So Citibank, Bank of America, you name it, it's mostly a handful of our very large banks. But the fee amounts and the rates are set by Visa and MasterCard. So all those banks that normally we think of as competitors that try to compete for our business as consumers don't have to compete on price dealing with merchants. And so what happens when you don't have price competition? Well, the prices go sky high. It's remarkably similar, I will tell you, to the way that OPEC operates on oil prices, where they set a target price and tell oil producing nations what to do. And if they all follow it, prices of oil go up, and we get pretty upset over here about that. This is the same thing, except actually the banks have a much stronger track record of following the advice than the OPEC nations do. At least the OPEC nations cheat once in a while.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things that if you're a small business, or if you're a restaurant, a convenience store, a movie theater, whatever it is, it's not like you can just say, "Well, I'm going to stop taking Visa and Mastercard." I mean, you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Look, consumers have these cards, they want to use them. Most consumers are not aware of these fees at all. So it's like a basic utility. You've got to take it in order to be in business. All of us can probably count on one hand. There's a couple businesses we know that are quirky, that have never taken cards. If you've never taken them, you can kind of get away with that if you're really loved. But for those who've started, you can't stop because customers will go somewhere else.
As consumers, we understand when the price of gas goes up, it's painful. And of course, it's easy to tie it right back to OPEC, and people understand, my gosh, I'm paying $4 a gallon. And, 2 years ago, I was paying, half of that. how do we tie our small business owners understand the fees are going up and it's affecting them. How do we help consumers understand why it's important to them? This is not about big business. This is about the small business convenience stores, the independently owned movie theaters, the dry cleaners, the pizza parlors. I mean, these are the companies that are being hurt. And what's worse, many of them are suffering from all the crime in some of these big cities. So they're just it's like death by a thousand cuts. How do we help consumers understand how important this is?
I think there's a couple ways. I think one is pointing out the scale of it and how high these fees are compared to other business costs, and also making folks realize that, look, we all end up paying for it. You can't possibly absorb fees that are just about as high as retail profit margins in total. Retailers would go out of business if they just absorbed that. There'd be no more profits left, right? So
Right.
obviously, as consumers, we're all paying those fees, and people really should understand that, because this is ultimately about all of us paying more. The other thing that people ought to understand is we've been going through this period of heightened inflation. It is very difficult for everyone. These fees and the fact that these fees are a percentage of the transaction are a huge multiplier of inflation, because every time we have 1 penny of inflation across the economy, that gets multiplied by whatever percentage the credit card fee is, right? And so business owners who, for example, have to try to keep up with heightened cost of goods, the grocery store has to pay more to get eggs and milk, so they have to raise their prices so that they don't take a loss on selling people eggs and milk. Well, as soon as they raise their prices to cover those costs, they get hit with higher fees. And so what do you do as a business owner, right? Do you raise your prices again to cover the fees? And then the fees go up again. That's the kind of vicious cycle that all of these folks face.
It's a little like
Didn't,
chasing your tail.
That's right.
yeah, and Doug, didn't I read somewhere that one of the credit card executives actually in one of his quarterly calls kind of talked about how inflation was good for them because their fees go up and therefore their profits go up.
That's exactly right. It was actually last year, Visa, on 2 straight quarterly earnings calls, their CFO and their CEO both said inflation was good for them. And look, that's how the business is built. It is good for them, and it's good for the banks that issue these credit cards too. It's a disaster for everybody else. Obviously, inflation is bad for Main Street. It's bad for individual Americans, but the credit card industry is profiting off of inflation on a regular basis. Even when inflation is low, they're profiting off of that inflation.
Well, and Elaine and I were just talking earlier about how the inflationary pressures on wages, how it affected real wages. But then we were saying that if you have debt, especially credit card debt, so as consumers, you're getting it both ways. You're paying a higher interest rate on your credit card debt, which is basically larger fees, but then you're also paying for uh, built into the cost of goods these extra fees on that end. So they've got you coming and going.
Well, that's a great point. And here's one thing that everybody should understand as well is the credit card industry tries to argue in a variety of ways that, oh, if you do anything about these swipe fees we make businesses pay, that will be worse for consumers. Somehow we'll treat them worse. We won't give them all the benefits we give them, on and on and on. But when you look at it from the other side of the coin, exactly to your point, as they charge businesses more, they charge consumers more too. And so they take advantage of everybody on both sides of that equation. Consumers get hit with very high interest rates. Folks who are carrying a balance right now are in a bad situation. They're paying 25, 30% interest rates. That's a scary prospect. And it's while they're exploding the fees on the merchants by more than 50%. So the whole story doesn't make sense. This is just a matter of the credit card industry taking more from everywhere and trying to hide and say, oh no, this is too complicated for you. Don't do anything because we know better than you do what's best for everyone.
Well, talk a little bit about the Credit Card Competition Act, because it's something that the Job Creators Network supports, our members support, and what would that do, and why would that bring some of those costs down, and why do the credit card companies don't like it?
Yeah, so the Credit Card Competition Act is the simplest and least interventionist way to deal with this problem. It basically looks at this and says, okay, we've got centralized price setting, which we normally don't like, is sort of a problem, and there's no competition on price. Well, let's make sure they have competition on price. And so it just says there ought to be two networks on a credit card. One might be Visa, but another one might be a smaller network like Star or Pulse or many of the other small networks that you might see sometimes on the back of a debit card or on an ATM machine. They do exactly the same things Visa and MasterCard do. Then those networks are going to have to compete on price to get the merchant's business. It's really simple. It's the way most business works around our country and around the world. And oh, by the way, our debit cards work that way and work perfectly well. There's no problem with our debit cards. There are credit cards in other parts of the world, have a couple of networks on there. So it's a proven, tried and true method to inject some competitive forces into the market. And frankly, look, it is, like I said, it's the most effective and most proven way to deal with the fees. And it doesn't say, hey, here's what the fees have to be or decide the outcome. It just says, let's have a market and let the market decide.
Yeah.
That's a great concept. It's something we fight for every day.
Crazy.
Well, we do a monthly poll called the Small Business IQ, and we poll on a number of issues, economic issues, but we decided to poll on this particular legislation. I mean, the support is amazing. 78% of our small business owners are like, yes, we need this. We need to have these fees come down. And what are you hearing from your members about this legislation?
There is overwhelming support for it. Our members are clamoring for it, given how high the fees have become and how fast they've grown. Other groups we've seen polling of 80, 90% support at times for this. Really, the only pushback comes when you talk to bankers and sometimes small bankers. The legislation has an exemption in it. No community banker in the nation would have to do anything based on the legislation. Only banks with more than $100 billion in assets would actually have to do anything. And the reason why that can happen and works very well is the top 10 or so banks have just about 90% of the credit card market. The truth is, they're using this system to eat the community banker's lunch every day of the week on credit cards. It's not fair. Those big banks have economies of scale so that their margin on a fixed, everybody charging the same fee is much larger. And they use that to market back to American consumers and grab more market share. It's not the way it should work. It would be better for smaller bankers as well as Main Street if this passed. But I understand for some folks, hey, change is scary. So it does run into opposition at times.
What kind of support do you have up on Capitol Hill for this?
So there is broad support across the ideological spectrum. Conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, you name it, there is a lot of support for it. Really, one of the most difficult things is that there are a number of members of Congress who would rather not have to take a vote and disappoint us or disappoint the credit card industry. But it's become such a big issue, I'm not sure that's going to be a sustainable position. At some point, Congress is going to have to make some decisions about whether they're going to fight for and protect Main Street, or whether they want the big Wall Street banks to win out without having to compete.
Well, my guess is that there's probably a lot to do with who's getting campaign contributions from who, based on that. I mean, because it seems to me, as you lay this argument out, that it's a pretty clear who is the underdog here, and who needs some relief.
So I hope that's not the case. Look, I've been doing this for a long time, working with members of Congress, and I honestly believe most of them do want to do the right thing. There's lots of pressures that they face in their job day to day, but look, Main Street will never match Wall Street's campaign contributions. It's just not going to happen. It's never going to be close.
Sure.
You can't do it. But Main Street is where people live their lives. It's where the votes are. It's where really political support and campaigns sink or swim, in my view. So I am hopeful, and indications so far are that that will win the day. But you're right. The financial pressure on the other side does make it challenging.
Sure. Sure. Well, one thing I didn't mention earlier is one of the things I've noticed as I've given to charities, where, whether it's a cancer charity or, food assistance, things like that, is that they are starting to ask for another 3% to help basically pay those fees. And I think when people think about, you know, retail stores, and whether it's Main Street or your members, whether you're going to the convenience store or getting gas, but there's a whole industry out there of nonprofits who really need help, and the credit card companies are swiping essentially 2 to 3% of all those donations, and so clearly this bill would help America's charities as well.
That's exactly right. Look, charities have a very difficult time with this, and people think they're giving their money to the charity, and they're giving a very sizable chunk of it to the credit card industry, which isn't fair. This is true when you donate to your church or synagogue or what have you. The same thing happens there. The local school, whatever. All of these things add up, and the credit card industry takes their cut, which is very difficult. I'll tell you, when you pay your taxes, you see a convenience fee get tacked on to cover these fees as well. And frankly, another place that's been very frustrating where these fees show up is, the credit card fee gets charged not just on the price of a product, but on the sales tax that the retailer has to collect on behalf of the government. And so the retailer loses money on collecting sales tax, doing a service for the state and for the city when they collect those tax dollars, because they essentially have to reach into their own pocket to make up for the tax money that the credit card companies took away. So everywhere you look here, there are problems with the way the system runs.
Clearly.
That's outrageous. That is egregious. Lawmakers need to fix that, particularly for Main Street. That's ridiculous that they have to pay this fee on the taxes even. How can our listeners find out more about the legislation, about Nacs, and what you're doing for Main Street America?
So there's a couple places where folks can go. We're part of a coalition, the Merchants Payments Coalition, and it's just merchantspaymentscoalition.com, where we've got background and information on the legislation and swipe fees and how all of this works. You can also go to convenience.org. That's our own website, and we've got lots of materials there about how we're advocating for the industry and on swipe fees. And look, just about any Main Street association, the Retail Federation, the grocers, FMI, you name it, they've got information on their websites too, because this is such a big issue for all of them. So those are good places to go and places to look. At the end of the day, really this comes down to people contacting their members of Congress, because individual consumers are really powerless to deal with this in your everyday choices, right? Whether you use a card or not, the fees are getting built in. Lots of people are using cards. And so we're all paying these fees. Even if you can't afford to have a credit card, you're paying with cash, you're paying the fees.
Right.
It all gets built in. So contacting their members of Congress, people letting them know that, look, this isn't acceptable and we need to have some change is just about the only way we're going to get any change.
Well, I know at Job Creators Network, we are definitely trying to get the message out because our small business owners have made their voices heard to us. And they need relief in this area too. They need relief in a lot of areas, but this is just one more. Like I said, for small businesses across America, right now it is death by 1,000 cuts, and many small businesses are very concerned about their future, their viability, and we need consumers to actually contact their congressman. Please, if you're for all of you listening, contact your congressman, talk to them about the Credit Card Competition Act. Tell them that they need to create a vibrant competition between these banks instead of these monopolies that are charging outrageous fees to our small businesses. Doug, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and educating our listeners on this very important issues and really helping to connect the dots for consumers and small business owners. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network, and new episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from.